So thank you everyone once again for joining us. This is the introduction to African fabrics, where I give you an overview of the indigenous fabrics from Africa. So welcome once again. I'm streaming live from Abuja. That's the capital city of Nigeria in West Africa. So if this is the first time you are encountering African fabrics and you happen to be at the NEQE venue, I want to say welcome. And thank you so much for stopping by our booth. And thank you for just engaging with us. I've chatted with a few of the ladies and it's been amazing. The atmosphere and the excitement, for us, we're particularly excited because it's our first time being in an in-person event and it's really, really exciting. Okay, so I'm going to go on. For those who don't know me, my name is Miriam Galadima Benson and I am the face behind Quilt Africa Fabrics. Like I said, I run Quilt Africa out of Abuja in Nigeria. And the start of Quilt Africa stemmed from my childhood adventures to the fabric market with my mother. At about age 10, 9, from 8 to about 10 years, my mom, who was a stay-at-home mother, but who ran a casual business by the side, selling wax prints, would take me on her market buying trips, and that was where I learned about the different types of wax prints, different types of fabrics that are obtainable in our local markets. And so that love for fabrics just birthed Quilt Africa Fabrics. And so I think it's always important to have a good background knowledge about the origin and the general overview of the fabrics of Africa as a whole, the traditions, the culture, the artistry, that is behind fabrics, the history, because that would lead you to better understand the modern day translation of fabrics across Africa. So as you know, African fabrics have a very long history. Right from 5000 BC, archaeological finds showed that the Egyptians who cultivated flax and linen had already learned the technique of creating fabric for clothing and other household use. Now, many cultures in Africa actually have the history of loom weaving. That's the principal method by which fabrics are made traditionally, culturally, historically. Fabrics have always been made on the looms, the vertical looms or the horizontal looms. And in some cultures, you find that there's a difference. Only certain genders can use the vertical looms and only certain genders can use the vertical looms, both the horizontal and the vertical. They don't cross gender use, if that makes sense. And these fabrics were woven from plants, mostly plants, either flax, bark of trees, or cotton, and in some areas, other types of plant fibers that are not so popular. Now, raffia palms are also a very popular source for fabrics, especially in Eastern to Central Africa, where you have the bark cloth, and the raffia strips of fabrics that are woven and painted. But I think from this introduction, what you need to just take note of is that African fabrics have a very long history, very, very long history. And the principal methods of creating the fabrics were on weaving looms, and the sources were either from animal skins, animal hair, plant fibers such as the palms, cotton, and other types of plant and other types of trees as well. So in Burkina Faso, pieces of fabric have been dated to the 11th and 13th century, and the earliest pieces of fabric, of course, were from animal skin and the hair, And fabrics as far as back as the 14th century, especially in Nigeria, they were used as legal tender. So because the skill was not widespread, people who could weave fabrics use them as legal tender. So if you have a fine piece of fabric, you could take it and use it as a means to get other types of goods and services. Now, the indigenous textiles of Africa, which are distinctively different from the wax prints that are so common and generally referred to as African prints, African fabrics, have always been natural. Silkworms, sheep, cowhide, trees, plants, cotton, flax, raffia, hemp. You know, I've already mentioned quite a bit of those. Those are what the Africans have always used from way back as fabrics. For instance, in some traditional festivals, you still see tribes who dance in their original traditional outfits. And these consist of raffia, like grasses. There are certain types of grasses that are used for skirts, you know, where both men and women wear. And then across the chest, you might have leather, or you might have other types of woven materials that are used across the chest. Now, as I mentioned before, looms are an integral part of the textile industry in traditional Africa. These looms were used to create about maybe 5-inch strips. So a weaver would sit down and weave 5-inch strips in long lengths, up to like 90 inches, as you can see from the diagram. And so each of these strips would involve dyed, already spun wool into threads, and they would weave them in patterns and designs and colors that meant something to that particular tribe. So the person in the image is Ghanaian, because Ghanaians have the kente fabric, which have distinctive colors and distinctive patterns. And so the knowledge of weaving these patterns and the colors and the technique and the skills were passed down from generation to generation. And it is believed that strip weaving originated from Mali, from the Telem people in Mali, because these remains were found in a cave and they were dated back like to a long time ago. But the skill has spread into the other parts of West Africa. And so the thing to note also is that weaving, strip weaving, is really common in Africa. You would hardly find this particular method of textile making in the eastern, the southern parts of Africa. The strip weaving is mostly consistent with Western Africa. And these countries include Cameroon, Liberia, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and of course, Nigeria. Now, the only odd country in the list I just read out is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in the eastern part of Africa. And so they're the odd country, I would say, that engaged in strip weaving. Now, popular textiles that are made from this woven textile are kente from Ghana, as you can see from the photo. And then you also have the ashoke from the Yoruba people in the southern part of Nigeria. So if you're listening and you have any questions or you have any comments, perhaps you have visited any one of these African countries and engaged with the weavers or the fabric makers, please drop a comment. As soon as I'm done, I'm going to attend to your questions. Now, like I mentioned earlier, each tribe have distinctive patterns that automatically identifies them with that tribe. In the Ghanaian people have the kente. The kente is by the Ashanti people. The Ashanti people's kente is different from the Ewe people's kente. And as you can see from the diagram, the Ashanti kente is the most popular kente in the whole world. I think I can say that. The kente patterns are the most popular in the whole world. And oftentimes you find people identify the kente as African fabric, when they don't know that there are various other types of fabrics. Once they see the kente, they know immediately that this comes out of Africa. But for us who are indigenous to Africa, who live in Africa, we can look at it and we can identify the different patterns by tribe. So you can see the Ewe Kente is a little busier. The patterns are a little smaller. There's almost no negative space, no solid space. Everything is filled up with patterns and is packed, and it's so symmetrical, it's just beautiful. And when you move to the Kente, the Ashanti Kente on my right, you see that it is, there's a little bit of breathing room between the patterns. There's some gaps, and then the patterns are so distinct. The patterns are so distinct. Most times they follow a similar way of being woven. And so when you come to the Ashoke by the Yoruba people, the Yoruba people's strip weaving mostly plays on the width of their lines and the colors, the stripes. So they don't really go into geometrical designs on their looms. Their looms are mostly straight lines, and the variance would be in the width of the lines and the colors. And sometimes you would have different weave types. And so I think after some time in Africa, interacting with, different types of tribes and cultures, you would begin to be able to differentiate who owns this pattern and who owns that pattern. There's also the Akwete from the people, from the Igbo people in the southeastern part of Nigeria. Theirs is very similar to the Ashoke, and it also comes in patterns and colors that mean something. Now, the Egyptians, who are one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, processed their flax that grew along the line, the Nile River, and they came up with linen, and they also grow cotton. And even today, you find that Egyptian cotton is one of the finest in the world. Very good quality, high thread count. Their cotton is still rated one of the best in the world. So is their linen. Egyptian cotton, Egyptian linen, I know always comes at a higher price point than other types of those fabrics. Madagascar is the little island off the coast of Southern Africa. And by their interaction with ship-faring traders on the coast, they were introduced to silkworms. Silkworms are not really indigenous to Madagascar or Africa, but because of the trade interaction between Asia and the Southern African coast, the silk cocoons, were brought in, and the Madagascans really picked on it. And now there's a thriving silk industry in Madagascar. And so you find they go through the long process of harvesting the silk, and allowing it to soak, and treating it, and they have some of the best silk that you can find, around. There's also some level of silk fabrics and textile in the northern part of Nigeria, where the Hausa people do some silk processing, especially for their threads, for their traditional embroideries. When you go further into North Africa, you find that the Moroccans and other countries in the Northern African coast, they use sheep wool, goat's hair for tapestry, because the northern part of Africa is mostly dry. You don't really have plants as such, but they are great herders. They take care of animals mostly. And so from that animal, a lot of their textile comes from them. Tapestries, rugs, carpets, and Northern African tapestry is one of the most expensive, the most luxurious you can find anywhere in the world. And so, I apologize. Have I gone off? No, I'm still sharing. Let me just go back to Sorry about that. And so one of the more peculiar textiles that you find in Africa is the one from the hem. The hem is a plant, and it's processed into fibers, and then it's woven into fabric as well. And so these are some of the samples of textile that is produced from plants. You have the Kuba, from the Kuba people in Congo. Congo is in Central Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo, where the diamond mines are, if you watch the movies, and where is always embroiled in, you know, some of the controversial things that go on related to mining. So the Kuba people there have this method of cloth making where they call the Kuba cloth and also the bark cloth. The Kuba cloth is named after the people of Congo. The bark cloth is from the bark of a tree. There's a special kind of tree that is grown and harvested only at specific times, so that the tree is allowed to grow and, you know, replenish its bark. But during the harvest time, the men go and they strip the bark, and the barks are beaten down and the fibers are separated, and then that's what is woven into cloth. And so the lines and the patterns you see are made from dyes. Sometimes the fibers are dyed before the weaving. Sometimes the weaving is done and then the pattern is drawn on. The bark cloth is not really popular as much as the mud cloth that comes out of Mali. But it's one of the oldest samples of African textile that you can find. And so you can see the women from Madagascar processing the silkworms, heating it. It's quite an arduous process, but it's an industry that is thriving at all levels, you know, subsistence and higher level processing and manufacture of silk in Madagascar. And you can see the middle photo shows the Egyptian cotton that is being harvested, you know, sorted, you know, and then handled and processed. And here we see a Moroccan woman weaving the rug. These fibers would be from animal, sheep's wool, you know, goat hairs and stuff like that. And so you can see that particular regions are synonymous with certain types of with certain sources of textile and certain methods. And so now I'm going to go into trying to give you an idea of how the patterns and designs in African fabrics come about. And also the colors and the decorations that you find on indigenous fabrics. Now, colors are really play a big part in art, in craft and art in Africa, because colors always have symbolic meanings. Now, back in the days, there were no dyes, so colors were got from natural items such as the camwood, you know, charcoal, peat from farm fields, rice fields especially, certain trees, certain barks, you know. Over time, indigenous people learned to mix this and mix that and ferment that to come up with colors. And so you find most indigenous fabrics don't have strong colors. The colors are just, they're not as vibrant as the produced ones in factories. Now, the major colors based on source, based on the availability, were black, red, white, green. These four colors are kind of like the African primary colors. And black, of course. It was easy to find from charcoal. White was easy from certain types of chalks and rocks. Red could be mixed from mud, and certain barks of trees, and then yellow from some fruits. So you could find, but black, red, white, definitely one of the more popular colors of Africa. Now, black had both a negative and a positive meaning or significance. And the positive would mean that black was actually a color of spirituality. It didn't necessarily signify death, but it was a strong color for spirituality, same as white. It could mean marriage. It could mean a rebirth. It could mean transition to the ancestors, which is not necessarily a bad thing within the context of African culture and tradition. And then on the negative side, it could mean death. It could mean being lost. It could mean being sad, and all of that. Blue represents faithfulness. It could also mean hostility and dislike. Now, blue is always one of the bestest colors in the world. You hardly find blue being associated with anything negative. But in some tribes of Africa, you find that blue meant hostility and dislike. Yellow could mean wealth. It could mean garden. It could mean reawakening. It could also signify thirst and withering, just a dying, a slow death. Green signified contentment. It could also refer to discord and illness. Green is another really positive color now in modern times. It talks about spring, it talks about awakening, it talks about life, and vitality. But within the African context, you find that it could mean illness or discord. Pink is not really a popular color because it's a mix of red and white. And the source at that time would have been not very popular, but it still means promise, high status, or it could mean poverty and laziness because it's neither red or white, it's just there. So sometimes they had a in-between sort of meaning. Now, red is one of the strong colors in African traditions. In fact, in some cultures, red is not worn by regular people. It just represented strength. It represented strong emotion, passion, bravery. It could also mean anger, red hot anger, the red hot anger of the gods. It could mean boundary. It could mean if you see somewhere, much like danger, if you see anywhere that there's red, it could mean a boundary. And most times these boundaries would be between the humans and the afterlife and the ancestors in the afterlife. White was also another amazing color in African tradition. It was mostly spiritual. And so you find that a lot of the priests and priestesses that would service altars and oracles and stuff would be dressed in white. A lot of their items of divination would be white, and so white is really the only principal color that you wouldn't find a negative for it. Yeah. So now back to designs and patterns. African patterns is always a series of geometrical shapes that are put together. What differs or what gives meaning to African patterns is the consonance of the shapes, the arrangement of the shapes, the repetitions of the shape, the placement of the shapes. But generally speaking, all African patterns are just geometrical shapes. The triangle is a really popular pattern, shape that is used in African art and textile. The curves, the waves is also another popular shape that is used. You also find squiggles. Squiggles also played a huge part because they could mean a journey, they could mean going deeper, So these are some of the significance that are attributed to some of these patterns. And so as you can see from the photos that I have here, the different images. And if you want to go deeper into the patterns of Africa, I have a course I call Connecting the Dots, where I made the connection between quilting patterns and some of the African patterns that we have. And then I shared the meanings of the African patterns, you know, and then give you an opportunity to recreate these quilting patterns in the African fabrics. So it's a really interesting course. It's, I think it's fantastic. I had a great time putting it together, because I'm sure in this photo you can spot some quilting patterns. Already I can see the flying geese. The flying geese is a very popular quilting pattern. And it's also a pattern that comes up again and again and again in all the tribal designs, all the tribal patterns across Africa. It's one of the most popular patterns that we have, the flying geese. You can see the diamond as well. The diamond is another pattern that is really popular in Africa. In a lot of the tribes and cultures, you know, use a lot of diamonds. They use a lot of triangles, particularly in that formation of the flying geese. Yeah, so anytime you browse our website, just search for Connecting the Dots and you'll definitely find that. And I highlighted about 12 patterns, you know, and related them to quilting, and shared the stories, you know, about them. Okay, so moving on. Mushrooms gave brown color. So remember I said that there wasn't manufacture of colors as you would understand it in an industrial world. So a lot of the colors that were used in either dyeing of baskets or clothing or wall painting, you know, or any of the African crafts you would find from nature. The inner bark of the trees, of the Nonto tree particularly, would give a crimson kind of color, not vibrant red, not quite pink, but just, you know, somewhere in between. Saffron, which is not even indigenous to Africa, was brought in by trade relations, you know, over time with Asia, gave the yellow color. In my tribe, we use orua. That's a plant. You eat the fruit, you know, and it's yellow. I mean, when you're eating the fruit, all your hands and everywhere around you would be yellow. I remember eating a lot of that when I was a child. So it would be soaked and then the color would be extracted, you know, so that gave a rich yellow. And so you have the eucalyptus leaves, which gave yellow green, and then rich soil from the fields would give black. And then you have kaolin, camwood rather, and clay would give you red. Charcoal would give you black. And also ashes. Ashes were also used to extract color, you know. So that's just to give you like an idea of how the traditional people would source for color and use color. And of course, because these are like natural dyes, their vibrancy wouldn't be the same as the colors that came from manufacture, by being manufactured. And so another important part of African textiles was the embellishment. You know, so in the next slides, I'm going to be sharing some of the popular ways in which African fabrics were embellished and try to categorize them by region and by tribe. So you just have a whole understanding of how everything works. So dye that we just finished talking about is one of the most popular ways in which fabrics were designed, embellished, beautified. This photo shows the dye pit. There were different methods of dyeing, and these dyeing methods represent the African batik methods that are popular now. So if the method of applying the fabric, or the resisting, the item that would resist the dye that would be placed on the fabric would define the name of the fabric. For instance, you have what is popularly called as the adire. The adire comes in different types. Adire just means doing something to cloth, and it could be by threading. If you know anything about dyeing cloth, there are some that you use ropes to tie. There are some that you stitch before putting into the dye. There are some that you apply wax. Traditionally in Africa, cassava paste would be used in place of dye. That was how it started out. Now, actual wax is used. But back in the days, it would be cassava paste. You know, that would be the resist. And the ones with the ropes also are very popular. You take the piece of fabric and you tie ropes in different designs, dip it into the dye, and the rope, the areas that the rope covered would stay white or whatever color is the original color, and then, you know, it would do that. Another very popular method of embellishment was dyeing and beadwork. Beadwork is very popular among the Yoruba people of Nigeria and the Zulu people of South Africa. In fact, I think the Zulu people of South Africa have one of the most amazing process of beading. You know, their beading held a lot of meaning. It held a lot of, you could have a whole conversation, or you could, it was mostly like a library. You could read a lot about a person by the pattern of their beads. You could tell whether they were married, you could tell whether they were parents, you could tell where they were from, you could tell their tribe, you know, just from the pattern of the beads that they wear. Embroidery was really, embroidery spreads across Africa. East to west, north to south. Northern Africans are big on embroidery. Western Africans are big on embroidery. Eastern Africans and Southern Africans as well. Silk would be used, spun, and that would be hand-spun silk, hand-spun cotton, you know, would be made into threads, and they will be embroidered on textiles. Now, embroidery also showed the status of the person wearing it. So a lot of the times in Africa, you would find someone wearing patterns that nobody else can, because that could signify royalty, or that could be, you know, or a priest, you know, or chosen person, or a forbidden person. There were always these categorizations which would be reflected in embroidery. Another popular method was applique, fabric on fabric sewed on and creating a different pattern. So these are the 4-5 ways that most indigenous fabrics were. Another one that I have not mentioned is actually painting and stamping. You would find that the back of calabashes would be carved, and they will be dipped in the dye, and they will be stamped on the fabrics. Painting is very popular in Mali. That's how the mud cloth is made. They have their process of creating the dyes by fermenting earth, this particular type of earth. They ferment it, you know, and then they draw it on a plain piece of fabric. And so I want to talk about the wax prints, which if you are at the New England Expo, that's what you would be seeing a lot at our vendors' booth. Sometimes people ask me the question, why do you say African fabrics? Why are you Quilt Africa Fabrics? You know, and you mostly don't feature a lot of indigenous fabrics. There's certain reasons for that I will talk about before I go into talking about the wax print on its own as a type of fabric. Now, so many times we hear about cultural appropriation, not using people's cultural items, you know, and traditions, and making light of people's traditions, you know. And so that's where And that's why indigenous African fabrics are not so common and popular. Because these indigenous fabrics carry the weight of the culture of the people. They carry the complete significance, or the real reason for its use. They carry it on themselves. If you look at the mud cloth now, or you look at the adire, or you look at the ashoke or the kente, there are certain patterns and certain designs that are only used by certain groups of people. One would be royalty. Second would be priests, priestesses, oracles of certain gods and goddesses. And so when you look at indigenous fabrics, it's very easy to cross boundaries with indigenous fabrics because you don't know. As a woman, should I be wearing red? Should I be wearing black? Should I be wearing white? If you go towards indigenous fabrics, you may never know and thus cause offense. Another reason is because indigenous fabrics are mostly handmade. Up until today, the methods of creating these indigenous fabrics are handmade. So even if you see a copy of indigenous fabric that is factory produced, it's mostly going to be in wax print. And so the volume of actual indigenous fabrics are not much compared to the factory-produced African wax. So for these two reasons alone, indigenous fabrics are not common. They are not popular. They are not all over the place. They are just limited because they're sacred in most cases, because they have the cultural rules. They are guided by rules and traditions. Even in my culture, there are certain articles of clothing or types of textiles that I cannot wear. How much more someone who is a visitor or a stranger, as it were. And that's the gap that the African wax print fills in. Because of the restrictions and the significance of indigenous fabrics in Africa, the wax print came and it carved a place for itself because there was a need. There was a need for people who were like low in the society or just average in the society, or didn't have a status, didn't have a position. The wax print gave them a chance to experience the culture of Africa without the weight, the weight of the strictures of actually using indigenous fabrics. And so over time, since its introduction into Africa in the 1800s by the Dutch traders, who at that time had colonized Indonesia, they were fighting one war or one occupation or the other in Indonesia. And they saw the Indonesian practice of making batiks. And they had the brilliant idea of mechanizing and taking over that market. But when they went to and produced them and brought them back into Indonesia, the Indonesians didn't like them. They wouldn't buy them. Because remember I said that each indigenous fabric carries with it its significance. And so a substitute will hardly do. There are certain occasions that I will go for that I will have to wear my indigenous textile, my indigenous fabrics. But ordinarily, I don't want to be burdened with comporting myself in a particular way that the indigenous fabrics will demand. And so I fall back on the wax print. And so I hope you can see the picture I'm trying to paint about why gradually the wax print has become African fabric. Because it's filling a gap. It's allowing you to be African without the weight of culture and tradition hanging on you when you wear the indigenous fabrics. And so back to my story, when the Dutch traders saw that the Indonesians were not crazy over their new invention, they brought it to Western Africa. Actually, the Africans who had been conscripted into the Dutch army, who were fighting or who had joined in the occupation of Indonesia, saw those fabrics and they brought it back to Africa. And that followed, the Dutch traders followed with it, and so it became popular. And so when the Dutch traders saw that the Africans liked the fabric, they began to investigate and they began to tilt their designs and patterns to mimic indigenous fabrics across Africa. Now, the thing to note is that the wax print came into the western part of Africa first, and it still remains dominant in Western Africa. And so in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, you will find contemporaries of the African wax prints, but they are not the wax print. And in fact, you find that in most countries in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, they import these fabrics from West Africa into these countries because they're not produced there. They are not the target markets, but because of the popularity of the wax prints, it has spread all over Africa. And for that reason, I call it the lingua franca of African textile. Lingua franca, in its loose meaning, means that it's an adopted thing. It refers to language, but pardon my creative license. I will use it in relation to textile and say that wax print is the lingua franca of African fabrics, of African textiles, because each tribe, each community has its distinctive style, its distinctive reason for these fabrics. The African fabric steps in and it levels the ground. It kind of levels the ground for everyone. And so it becomes a lingua franca. The West African can use it, the Eastern African can use it, the Southern African can use it, the Northern African can use it, and it just identifies you as an African, you know, without breaking any taboos. So it unifies 3,000 tribes and the 2,000 languages that are found in Africa. And so it gives African textile a face that just the Kente will not, or just the Ashoke will not, or just the Kuba cloth will not, or just the bark cloth will not. The African wax print has become the lingua franca of Africa. And honestly, as Africans, I don't think we're too bothered by the fact that it's a Dutch invention. Somehow we have owned it, we celebrate it, we love it, we enjoy it, you know, we contribute to its evolution decade after decade after decade since its introduction to the African shores. And so over time, you find that the style, the pattern, the colors of the African wax print has changed. It started with the Velisco company, the Dutch, mimicking totem symbols and colors that were meaningful to the West Africans and recreating them in this wax print. But over time, a more modern feel to the wax print has come on. For instance, this one that I'm wearing almost looks like an indigenous type of fabrics, but it's not. It's a recreation in wax print. And so the wax print is the new way that Africans represent and tell their collective stories of being African without the strictures of their culture and their tradition and the taboos and the rules that govern indigenous fabric. I hope that is kind of clear. Region to region, country to country, the fabrics are just so many. But when you approach African wax print, you know that, yes, this is from an African. All right. So same thing with the indigenous fabrics. The fabrics of the wax print are geometric. They play with color. They play with the ethnic repetitions, you know, and all of that. And since the 1950s, when the wax print was at its most popular, female entrepreneurs got this marketing strategy of naming the fabrics. And so in the market today, you'll find fabric names such as Fish Scales, Money Has Wings, 1004, Darling, Don't Turn Your Back on Me. That's the name of a fabric of a wax print. Bible and Star, and so many others. So many others in the African market. It's interesting going around and asking the names and listening to them and listening to the stories behind the fabrics. Because Africans are like storytellers, so that works really well. And so the role of African fabrics, whether you're now talking about the wax print or the indigenous fabric, is so important. Fabrics have a spiritual importance because, like I said, fabrics of certain patterns, certain colors may not be worn by the ordinary citizen. They are strictly reserved to be worn by rulers because they are seen to be gods on earth. They strictly to be worn by priests because they are the connection between the ancestors and the people. And so there are certain fabrics that you wear for festivals and ceremonies, sacred occasions, royal occasions, coronations, initiations, coming of age ceremonies, and the 1001 ceremonies and festivals that we have in Africa that brings us together as a community, as a tribe, as people, you know, with one accord. For instance, the Dogon people of Mali who create the mud cloth say that the process of their fabric making is like a rebirth, is a reproductive process, which makes sense to me because creating is a birth. Whether you are a fabric designer, producer, or you're a quilter or any sort of textile artist, you're actually birthing. You incubate your idea for a long time and then you go through the process of birth and you bring that out to the world. So I totally agree with the Dogon people in Mali to say that every creative process, even textile production process, is a reproduction. And so the symbolic meanings that accompany the geometry, the synchronicity, the balance you find in African fabrics is individual to each tribe. What the flying geese, for instance, would mean in one African tribe is different from what it will mean in the other tribe. It's peculiar to that tribe, but it could say so much, you know, about that particular tribe. And so there's always the caution that whenever you are handling authentic African items, whether it's the sculptural or the arts or the textile, there should be some level of caution because you don't want to use it in a way that offends the original owners of that particular item. And so fabric tells a story of identity, of wisdom, of wars, of famines, invasion, colonialism, and in modern day, it talks about political struggles. It talks about political heroes. It talks about national heroes, because since the 60s, you'll find the image of, there's even one for the Queen Elizabeth when she did for her coronation. Not too long ago, you found the Kenyans with the face of Barack Obama, who is, whose origin lies in Kenya, you know. And so the fabric and the textile of Africa is really about storytelling. It's really about identity. It's really about chronicle. It chronicles the people to which it's peculiar to. Yeah. So there are historical documents. You talk about Pan-African heroes. We have some with some past presidents. We have some with, you know, all sorts of things. Every time a chief or a ruler is going to be instated, sometimes even during elections, you find fabric that has the face of the popular candidates on it. So it's really a chronicle. It's a storytelling device. It's a historical document. And so I'll round up with this quote from Chris Spring from African Textiles Today, who says that history in Africa is to be read, told, and recorded in cloth. And that is so, so true. So thank you so much for coming. I'm going to stop my share. That brings me to the end of my presentation. And I hope that you got something of value that would help you understand what African Fabrics is about and, you know, what it means. And as you go through our booth at the New England Quilt Expo, that as you feel the fabrics and you touch them, you are like, you kind of understand where it's coming from. You understand where I'm bold to say Quilt Africa Fabrics, because like I said, the wax print is the lingua franca, is a touch point, is the touch point for indigenous Africa, is a touch point for cultural Africa, is a touch point for cultural Africa as well, and traditional Africa, and everything about Africa is just in her cloth. So thank you so much for coming. I apologize once again for the late start and the technical difficulties that we had. As you know, that is always a part of being online, but I appreciate your patience, and we'll be back again tomorrow where I'll be demonstrating the care. I'll be talking about the care of African fabrics, and I hope to demonstrate 1 or 2 ways you can take care of the fabrics that you're purchasing from our booth. So don't forget to take a photo with Nancy and tag us at Quilt Africa Fabrics. On Instagram, it's Miriam_Quilt Africa Fabrics. On Facebook, it's Quilt Africa Fabrics. Tag us and you stand to win a prize. So I'm really excited for the opportunity to be at the New England Quilt Expo. Thank you for the warm reception that you have given us by extending it to Judy and to Nancy. And I hope to see you tomorrow and also on Saturday as we close out the expo. So thank you so much for joining me, and leave any questions that you have in the chat and I'll be sure to address it. So see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.